as the director of the Zhang Legacy Collection Center up at Western Michigan University. She's going to tell you the story tonight of her health issue, and again, most of you know that, but after the transplant, she did get, and this part I have to read because she never told me about it, a graduate certificate in integrative holistic health and wellness, holistic approaches to mindfulness from Western Michigan University. She actually admits to this. She is married to me, and she has now been retired since 2020 from Western Michigan University. She works sometimes as a contract employee doing some consulting as an archivist, and in her free time she enjoys historical research, hiking, cooking, a pastime that I enjoy that she has, and she does spend time with our dear beagle friend Callie, who we recently adopted. Callie is a retired research beagle. So with that, before, as long as I should stop now, as long as I can make sure I get home this evening, or at least into the house, I am going to turn the mic over here, and it'll take just a moment or two here while we hook up the lavalier mic. But did anybody have, I should have asked, did anybody have any other announcements they wanted to make tonight while we're going through this, the technical side of this? So I'm.
Okay.
Oh, if you did not get our little booklet, that handy little book, an announcement? Oh. Oh, Alan wants a copy of the booklet from Jim. Okay. Yeah. These things get complicated. But with that, I'm going to turn this mic off and turn the mic over to Sharon. And having had some knowledge of what her story is, I think you'll find it interesting.
Well, you're going to see some pictures and hear some things, though, that you haven't heard before. So we've talked about the ancients tonight, and I thought the ancients would be a good place to start. This concept of hepatocentrism, the idea that the liver is actually central, to the central foundation of health. And before the 17th century, actually, many believed that blood came forth from the liver. But what we have here, we have a vase, a large urn, and it shows, this is by the painter Cleo, let me get my name right, I'm not an art historian, but Cleophrades. And here we have a liver on a platter being presented to an emperor. And so I think the liver has been something that, we all know it's super important. I think the ancients knew it was super important. We know a lot more today about what the liver does and how the liver functions and so on. The liver is one of the largest and most important organs in a person's body. It's about the size of a football, weighs 3 pounds in the average body. This is kind of a blow-up of the liver. And the one feature on this slide that is very critically important to me, those are bile ducts. Those two squares below the liver, those are bile ducts. And you can see that the top bile duct system looks kind of healthy. And a bile duct is actually about the size, my understanding, it's about the size of maybe a needle. I mean, they're very, very small. But what we have below are diseased bile ducts. And if you've never thought much about bile ducts, and I have to admit, I never thought too much about bile ducts until mine went south. But in any case, this is what we're dealing with. The liver does everything. The liver, almost all the blood in your body passes through the liver. The liver stores nutrients, removes waste products, worn out cells, filters and processes chemicals and food, alcohol, medications. It produces bile, a solution that helps digest fats and eliminates waste products. As soon as people started having liver problems, Others tried to find ways to cure those liver problems, and sometimes not without a great deal of success. But some of the 19th century advertisements, Carter's Little Liver Pills, sluggish liver for cure for the sluggish liver, or the torpid liver, or this Andrew's liver salt. And this might be, I got this off of a website. I don't know if this was an American product or if this was something they sold over in England, but you find them and they're kind of interesting, to look at and such. Today, of course, if you have a liver and it's failing, and it has failed, a transplant is probably going to be your best option. And when I started this process, I was told that, when you get a liver transplant, you basically trade in one set of problems for a new set of problems. And there's a little bit of truth to that. Why do people get liver transplants? Acute liver failure, the overdose of Tylenol, or the magic mushrooms that were mushrooms you weren't supposed to eat. Hepatitis C is another leading cause. Alcoholic liver disease. Then cancer, liver cancer or bile duct cancer. There are several other unknowns. Primary sclerosing cholangitis, and at a certain point I'm just going to call it PSC, and that's the term that is frequently bantered about. It falls under that category of cholestatic diseases, and those are diseases that affect the bile ducts or affect the biliary system. And so about 8% of people getting liver transplants, they may have primary sclerosing cholangitis, or a person that I met through, we were actually both getting listed at the same time, she had a condition known as primary biliary cirrhosis. So, but primary sclerosing cholangitis, PSC. There's so many things in this illustration. You have a liver that is experiencing cirrhosis. If you look in the kind of to the right of this man, it shows that he had an active case of ulcerative colitis going. He looks slightly yellowed, so jaundice, fever, and chills. And those are some of the symptoms that do present. Of course, primary sclerosing cholangitis. Cholangitis is an inflammation of the bile duct system. Sclerosing is referring to the hardening or the narrowing of the bile ducts, and primary is simply an indicator that it is the primary disease process. It's not secondary. The cause is unknown, but it's likely genetic, autoimmune. There are possibly environmental triggers. Risk factors are a male. Most of the time men get this disease, probably 60 to 70% of the time. And a lot of them present around age 30 to 40. Most of the time they've had a history of some type of inflammatory bowel disease, like ulcerative colitis. And here's another close-up again, showing the cirrhosis of the liver, showing the duct system, the pancreas. So it's a complicated disease, and one that presents a lot of complications as time goes on. It's progressive. It's progressive, and it's an extremely unpredictable disease. In fact, as I was talking with Dr. Dewan this evening, he said maybe 10% of his patients actually do get to the point where they need a liver transplant. But along the way, you might develop portal hypertension. And then there are this cholangitis, infection of the bile ducts. And I probably experienced this, I think, at least 3 or 4 times. And at a point, it's very similar to me, like having the flu. And I didn't have a bad case. I mean, you can die from cholangitis. Another possible complication is bile duct or liver cancer, a much more increased risk. The part that even a lot of doctors don't really talk about are the vitamin and mineral deficiencies. It really plays a trick on your digestive system. And those mineral deficiencies often will result in bone density loss. So I'll talk more about that as we go on. And if you do present with PSC and you have ulcerative colitis, your risk of colon cancer, it's very, very high. I'm a member of the, colonoscopy a year club, and I probably will be for the rest of my life. So it's just the way it is. Treatment options for PSC. There's a medication that I took for many years, Urso Forte. In my case, it really helped my alkaline phosphatase levels because it does actually, it improves the flow of your bile. I know at one point they were doing studies and some patients were given high dose Urso. I was very excited about that. I was reading about that shortly after I was diagnosed, but in the end it turned out that this was not really, it didn't do what they wanted it to do. In time, when you have symptoms, if you start experiencing edema or itchiness, scratchiness, you get medications to deal with the symptoms. There's a lot of monitoring, blood draws, ERCPs, and I'll talk a little bit more about an ERCP later, what that is. Waiting for the other shoe to drop. I lived with this disease, I guess 12 years before I lived with it for a long time, over a decade. And, I'd get my labs, I'd see my doctors, Dr. Dewan, and then I'd try and forget about it sometimes. And but I was always like nervous, especially when he started adding some of the additional labs to my my regular routine. And transplantation. If you are young enough, healthy enough, and you meet the criteria for a liver transplant, that's the ultimate treatment option. So doctors have been interested in this whole aspect of transplantation for a long time, at least for the last 90 years, 80 years. I bumped into this guy, this Dr. Dmitrikov, Russian doctor, and I should have warned you ahead of time, I am a dog lover, and if there are dog lovers, that's a dog with 2 heads and 6 legs, if you can't see it easily. He did a lot of experimentation in the 1940s and 50s in Russia, and some of this I think did ultimately contribute, to the understanding of, transplants, but he transplanted one dog with a heart transplant in 1953, actually survived for 7 years after the operation. But he is responsible for trying the first artificial heart in a dog, first lung transplant, first liver transplant, first head transplant. These were all carried on with dogs. And so I wasn't sure I was going to tell this story, but I will. Tom Overdy, and I was going to talk a little bit about the dogs in my life. And but Callie, our retired research beagle, when we adopted her, I was second in line, and I still don't know. I think the first person pulled out. She was part of a program, Cages to Freedom, because when you adopt a research beagle, and when we adopted Callie, she was 2. And all she had ever known was life in the lab. And so you're basically dealing with a 2-year-old puppy. And so they're a little bit, I don't know, they're a little fussier when they adopt out the research beagles. And it's the only time I ever used the transplant, that I thought it might bolster my chances. I put it on the application, all the experience we had with dogs and, that we were older patient people and, we'd work with her. And I said, and I also know that dogs were used in early, transplant experiments. And, if this is a way I can give back, please, I'll give back. So in any case, it's the only time I ever pulled the transplant card. So, the first, I'm going to talk now about some more recent successes, and I'm going to focus on Americans. There are doctors all over, researchers were studying this for a number of years. But Dr. Joseph Murray, first successful kidney transplant, it involved Richard and Ronald Herrick. So this was performed December 23rd, 1954 at Peter Brent Brigham Hospital, now Brigham and Women's Hospital. So we have the twins, Ronald and Richard. Richard, 22 years old, he's joined the Coast Guard, and his kidneys start to fail. He sees a doctor, and he's told that he has an incurable condition. By August of '54, he could barely walk, and his brother, the story goes, his brother met with his brother's physician and said, gee, I'd do anything for my brother. I'd give him one of my, kidneys if it would help. And the doctor, initially, no, you can't do that because of rejection, but then realized the opportunity with identical twins, because Richard and Ronald Herrick were identical twins. And so Dr. Joseph Murray performed the transplant, and Richard lived for another 8 years. And his brother Ronald had a full life. He actually, they were both born in 1931, and Ronald died, I think, around the year 2000. He actually had complications from heart surgery. So, and then Dr. Thomas Starzl, first successful liver transplant. What I was reading about Starzl at the time that he is, working on the early liver transplants, all of which, he performed at the University of Colorado. In the early 60s, a number of doctor researchers are studying this, literally, different parts of the world. But in '63, he attempted 5 human liver replacements. The first patient bled to death during the operation, and the other 4 died between 6.5 and 23 days later. Now, what he noticed, they performed autopsies after this death, and it did not seem to be the graft, but it was infections. And so, this got him thinking and working on the whole aspect of, immune response, and how you deal with when you're not going to get a transplant from, your identical twin sibling. And so he is also known for his work in drug combinations as a thiaprine and corticosteroids in kidney transplants, and then later on in liver transplants. And he was also involved with FK506 or tacrolimus, and that is a drug I take. Actually, I started with regular tacrolimus, and now I'm on something called Imvarsis, which is an extended tacrolimus. So with this, new technology, this new knowledge, liver transplants, they've gone from experimental to something that literally thousands are being, performed every year. And it's, I won't say it's routine, but it's amazing once you've had one and you start talking to people. Literally, I was sitting downstairs waiting, for Dr. Dewan and his wife. I was talking to the hostess, and and I said, I'm doing a talk tonight, and I told her a little bit about it, and she said, oh, my uncle had a liver transplant, and he was in his early 70s, and I guess he's had it a couple of years, and he's doing great. So, you never know. Survival rates, they've gotten really pretty decent. 86% at 1 year, all the way. I love this chart because it has survival rates up to 20 years. And keeping my fingers crossed that, if it's 20 years, that I've got, I guess, another 15 after now. So, but in any case, every center will have different rates. Henry Ford's 1 year rate is 93% and 87% at 3 years. And I didn't find their 5 year rate, but in any case. And why a liver transplant either sticks or doesn't stick. Organ rejection. And that can happen at any time, but my understanding is it is most common probably within the first 6 months. Infections. You are taking, immune suppressing drugs. And so you're more vulnerable to anything. High blood pressure. kidney problems. Some of the drugs that you take, in fact, some of the drugs I take for my ulcerative colitis and that I take for the transplant, they are very hard on the kidneys. And I religiously drink. I'm always drinking water or a very weak decaf coffee, and that's why. High cholesterol. And up to 15% of transplanted patients will develop new onset diabetes. And of course, increased risk of stroke and heart attack, increased risk of cancer. You can also have recurrent disease, and that does happen. It happens with PSC in not a large number of cases, but it does happen. So this is me in 1985. And I hate this picture. I've always hated this picture. I hate this picture because my face is all puffy. I am in the middle of my treatment for ulcerative colitis. And it's the beginning of my story. In 1985, I had been married for 2 years. I got married at age 20, my first time around. That was silliness. We both knew it was silliness not too long afterwards. We got married as undergraduates. And I started experiencing the symptoms of ulcerative colitis the summer of 1984. But we were poor students. I didn't have health insurance. I think I went to Syracuse. They tried something, and then the fall semester started, and it's like, oh God, got to get back to school. And so I lived with pretty bad ulcerative colitis for about 6 months. And I decided the marriage was failing. I was very sick and had no insurance, and I decided my best bet was to get a good job with benefits, and I became the receptionist in the College of Education at the Office of Advisement, Admissions and Field Placement at Western Michigan University. And we had one of our advisors in the office was a man named Chuck Comer, and Chuck Comer, he did a lot of photography on the side. And so I don't remember, I think we were kind of doing an updated directory on the wall, and and that was the day, show up, look good. This was kind of a sailor type dress. I remember wearing it to a wedding that summer, and there I was in my picture with my fat, puffy moon face from all of the prednisone. And as soon as I did get a job, I went to see a doctor. I saw Dr. Joseph Bruno, and he was my primary care doctor, and he cured me of ulcerative colitis. Now, that is very, very, very silly. I was a very silly girl when I was in my 20s. I took that prednisone, I took that azolfidine, and and I was well, and that was that. And then I didn't see a doctor, for many, many more years. I had a couple of flares, and those flares would get me into a doctor. But yeah, I now realize, I could have taken a lot better care of myself at that time. I ended up getting divorced, and I kind of buried my grief and sorrows. I focused on myself. I focused on my career. And when we get to the period of, the late 90s, early 2000s, I was unstoppable. Oh gosh, I was on fire. I bought a house in 1997. Stupidest thing. I mean, that house had so much stuff, and we still live in it, and it looks a whole heck of a lot better now. But I bought a house, all on my own. I'm going to fix this place up. I finished a master's degree in library science in 2001. I finished my PhD in 2002, all while I was working at Western Michigan University, and my responsibilities were increasing. I'd been named director in '98, and then I found magic in the archives. This tall, handsome guy from Detroit who had transplanted himself to Kalamazoo for work reasons came into the archives, and a few years later we started dating, and we got married in 2002. And that was followed by 2003, which was Western Centennial. And talk about being in a situation, where your library, your archive is kind of in everybody's, vantage point. It was very heady. And the only thing that I did really to take good care of myself at this time, I actually did see a dentist twice a year. My dentist at the time was Dr. Miklas Austrins. I'm half Latvian, and he was the Latvian dentist, and I don't know, for whatever reason, when we were kids, we never went to see doctors, but we always went to see the dentist, and I continued that as an adult, that habit. And so it was actually my dentist, Dr. Austrians, who was the first person who said, I think your thyroid is enlarged, and next time you see your doctor, you should probably talk to him about it. Well, I had no plans to see my doctor, but I made an appointment and saw him, and this is all starting to happen, I think, around late 2003, early 2004. So I go to see Dr. Bruno, and the thyroid issue is very soon taken care of, and I've been on a dose of Synthroid ever since. But I had this one lab, the alkaline phosphatase, and this is a lab that I think the top level now, they say it should be 117. I just looked at my labs that I had done about a week ago. Well, mine kept presenting in the 600s. It was the 600s, and it just wouldn't go down. And, we tried a couple things, and then finally he said, well, I think you need to see somebody else. And that's when Dr. Dewan entered my life. There are good things that come out of every bad situation. And Dr. Dewan is truly, one of the good things that came out of this situation. I had never seen a specialist, so I had taken my cat to see a specialist. I didn't have a dog yet, so I hadn't taken my dog to see a specialist yet, but I was just flipping out big time. But I made the appointment. I went to my first appointment alone. I saw him. He had an office out at West Main, that facility at the time. And I remember going in there, and everybody in the waiting room, they were all probably 20 years older than me. There was one young man. He was older than me, maybe 50. I'm about 41 at this time. And he is so jaundiced. I'd never seen such a jaundiced person in my life, and I tried not to look, but he had kind of sandy blonde hair, and it was almost like his hair and his skin blended. So Dr. Dewan, saw me, and then we ran some more tests, and then I went back for another appointment, and that's when he gave me the news. I'd done a little bit of research online. I kept running into PSC, and I kept running into the other primary biliary cirrhosis, or cholangitis now I think they're calling it. And because I had the history of ulcerative colitis, it jumped out at me. But most of the people who were getting it, most of them were middle-aged men, and I was a middle-aged woman at that time. But Dr. Dewan gave me a cursory overview of PSC, told me, how the bile ducts worked, how big they were, what the disease process could look like. And he was very oddly reassuring, though. He told me, and actually it was almost like we just had that conversation again tonight, the way he said it. He said, some people have this for years without problems. Maybe I would need a transplant at some point, but then again, maybe not. It could shorten my lifespan, but he would work with me to keep me cancer-free. And I jotted down the name of the disease. I actually, when I did some COVID cleaning, I found it. I misspelled it. I became very good at spelling it, though, because unless I was in, every doctor I ever encountered had heard of PSC. But if I was not in an area that dealt with gastroenterology or liver issues, I usually had to, with nurses, I usually had to tell them what it was, and I had to spell it out for them because they had never heard of it. So where am I? So when I was first diagnosed, Dr. Dewan did a biopsy, and I don't think my brother knows this. I spent a night in Borges because, and then after the biopsy, I felt like somebody kicked me in the side for the next couple of weeks. And he also performed what's known as an ERCP. And the ERCP, they basically, they send a tube down through the mouth, and they look at the bile ducts. The ERCP can be a diagnostic tool, and it also can be a therapeutic tool because they will brush for cancer cells. I mean, they do brushings, and they are looking, to see if any of them are cancerous. And they can also, put a stent in. Stents are used sometimes to open and keep bile ducts open. I had one in 2004 when I was diagnosed without issue. And in 2007, Dr. Dewan, he was very adamant. He thought I should have another one. So, I have another ERCP. This time I got very sick. And there is depending on the sites I looked at, a 5 to 10% chance of developing pancreatitis. I developed acute pancreatitis, and I had what was called a pseudocyst that I think it was after I was healed, and I knew I was kind of on the road to recovery. I guess it was about the size of a grapefruit, and my midsection hurt. I was hospitalized initially for 3 weeks. They sent me home with PICC line, and I was getting liquid nutrition. I developed an infection. I went back in the hospital, and this time Dr. Dewan would not let me out until I could eat soft food. And I remember we were going around about some peaches, I think, and some cottage cheese that you really wanted me to get down. So I did. It was a rough summer, though. By this time, I had switched my primary care doctor to Dr. Daniel Goldberger, and mainly because he was with a practice that I knew that the person I had seen before, he had a very small practice, and I wanted to have some assurance that if I really needed to get in, I could get in. And his practice at the time, Dr. Goldberger's, I had those assurances. I did what a lot of people do, I guess, in the internet age. I found a group. I'm kind of glad I found this group. It's PSC Partners Seeking a Cure. When I was first diagnosed, it was a listserv that I signed up for. And at times I would subscribe, and then if I got bounced off, I'd forget about it, then I might re-up. Because again, sometimes I just wanted to forget that I had this. And people who were obviously ahead of me in the disease process, they would be listing information about their transplants. And I think I was still kind of in big denial. I remember reading at that point, I think the University of Michigan, they were trying a procedure, basically seeing if a dialysis-like procedure could be used to help people with liver problems. But I was banking on U of M to save me. And in any case, didn't work out that way. But this group, eventually, they became a nonprofit. They sponsor annual conferences. They've donated more than $5 million toward research. And one year, 2009, they had their conference in Chicago. And Tom and I decided we would go because we literally live about 2 blocks away from the Amtrak station. And we walked down and we got on the train. I didn't know what to think, going to a kind of medical type conference. And it turned out it was really an enjoyable weekend. I met a couple other people from West Michigan. They identified people, whether they were, I guess where they were at in the disease process, or whether they'd had a transplant or not, or whether they were a caregiver. And we had breakout groups, and they fed us very well. It was a good conference. And the other thing is, especially after that bout of pancreatitis, I think it made me a little more serious about what do I want to do in life. And one of the first actions was we adopted a dog. This is Frank. I don't know why I wanted a dog. I've always had cats. I still have cats, but I always loved dogs, and we had talked about doing it someday when Tom retires. But no, I decided in 2008, someday is now. And one of the best things I ever did, he helped keep me active when I declined. He helped get me active, after I had my surgery. I took a 3-week trip to Venice, and Tom and I spent some time in Lyon. The Lyon trip was in 2014, and that was kind of 2014 wasn't a good year for me. I had several of those bouts of cholangitis, none of them serious enough to land me in the hospital, but I know I had a prescription for Cipro, and at a point I just always had it because, and how these would feel, like I said, they felt to me like a bad flu coming on. And I remember, I think it was the last Christmas my mother was alive. We were over, I'd worked that day. I think it was the day that Western was playing a bowl game, and Western was open, but we watched the bowl game. We closed up the office, and then I went over to my mother's for Christmas Eve. And I was doing all right, but then at a point I got that old familiar, the shivers, the chills, because you usually do develop a fever. I would usually get a wretched backache, and I know we'd taken our dog along, and I just took the dog. I said, I'm going to sit in the other room with the dog, and then I asked for a blanket. And we had not really let my family know about this. They knew about the hospitalizations, but I kind of chalked it up to my mother knew I'd had ulcerative colitis. And to say that I come from a family that doesn't do well with medical stuff is kind of an understatement. My mother, her last hospitalization, after she gave birth to my brother in 1967, I think the next time she was in a hospital for anything was probably 2016. And in that time period, if she saw a doctor 10 times, I'd be surprised. She didn't have a primary care physician until the last 3 months of her life. She actually, one point, she had to go to ER at Borges. She'd fallen and she cut herself. And I offered to go back with her to take the stitches out. And I remember I was like, you know, if you had a primary care doctor, you could just float into that doctor's office. And I was secretly hoping that we'd have to sit for 6 hours in the ER. But that was the time at the ER where she floated right in, she floated right out, and you know, she didn't want to talk to me anymore about primary care doctors. So in any case, so I kind of kept it from them. And as I said, 2014, when we were in Lyon, I presented a paper at the International Federation of Library Associations. It was thrilling. We did some tourist stuff. But Tom, you know, after we came back and, you know, after we talked, you know, Tom remarked that we pretty much, I'd get done conferencing, we'd eat, we were staying across, very close to this very large park. We might take a walk through the park, and we'd go back to the hotel and we'd go to bed. And so I think it was starting to catch up with me, but I didn't realize it yet. So when I had these issues, Dr. Dewan, during our regular appointment, he really thought it was crucial that I get another ERCP. And of course, I wasn't thrilled about getting another ERCP because I'd had such a bad experience. But he said, well, maybe you should go see Dr. Evan Fogel. And he was at Indiana University Health. And so when I went there in 2014, and I did end up, I think of, I guess, this facility and his work, kind of the I started calling this the roto-rootering of the bile ducts. And so this is like the ERCP capital of the Midwest, where they're rooting out bile ducts all the time. I mean, this guy, I don't know how many he does, and he's got engaged in research. And but in any case, you know, he knew my history. I did end up with a mild case of pancreatitis. Had to be readmitted through Methodist Hospital in downtown Indianapolis after hours, and I'd never gone into an ER with a metal detector before. I'd left the hotel with a wastebasket, and I was just sitting in a corner heaving my guts out. And finally, when they got me back and they tried to administer an IV, they finally administered an IV in my foot. I was so dehydrated. But in any case, I got better. We came home, and I resigned myself to the fact that I now had another doctor I was going to be seeing once a year. And I've had other ERCPs with him, you know, without incident. He put stents in. The stents didn't really do what he wanted them to do. But when I went back to see him the next year, 2015 had been a good year. I don't recall that I'd really had any attacks. And I was fully expecting when I went to see him that he would say, oh, you know, things are looking good, or, you know, things haven't changed. I mean, when you have a disease like this, even having nothing change is a good thing. But when he tried to go in and do my ERCP, to the left side is a healthy biliary tree. And this is an X-ray, you know, from an ERCP. And when he showed me mine, and I don't know, maybe I should see if I can get a copy, I looked at it and my first thought was, I have Charlie Brown's Christmas tree. That if you spend time on Western's campus, you know, the kind of tree of knowledge statue that's over there by Sangren, that's kind of what my ERCP looked like. not with, if you see this, I put my pointer away, but basically what I'm trying to point out here is, I'm trying to point out bile ducts and destroy the equipment. But you see all of those nice flowing bile ducts, and well, mine weren't. And Dr. Fogel's words, I think it's time you made the acquaintance of a transplant team. That was very, very sobering to me. And then he went on, he talked about the program they had at Indiana University. And of course, when I got back to Kalamazoo and saw Dr. Dewan, we talked about what the options were in Michigan. Still, though, I vacillated. I wasn't really sure. I still felt pretty good, and especially after I wasn't having as many of those cholangitis attacks. But we looked at University of Michigan, Henry Ford, and initially I was kind of gaga for the University of Michigan. I love Indian food, and I had visions of getting a transplant and then maybe spending a couple weeks, I don't know, in Ann Arbor eating Indian food. It would be a year before I would eat Indian food again, let me tell you. We chose Henry Ford because they do more liver transplants than U of M. They had a shorter waiting list than U of M. And I'm going to botch this, but a term for Henry Ford is the hospital with, if something goes wrong with a liver transplant at the U of M, it gets bumped up to Henry Ford. And that's not a lot of people don't necessarily think about Henry Ford that way. I think it's a hidden jewel in Michigan. But in any case, I met with doctors at Henry Ford and decided to go through with the listing process. And in the end, what got me into the listing process was that fear of cancer. Dr. Dewan had added a tumor marker to my regular labs, and I have to say, every time I had labs drawn, I would kind of wait and I'd watch, and I would watch this tumor marker. And it's not a tumor marker that is 100% reliable, but it can tell you, that things are going on that you don't want to be going on. But I went through the listing process, and it was a 2-day affair. We arrived in Detroit on May 16th, 2016. Got there for lab work. I went through cardiac tests, stress test, walking on a treadmill. The second day began with an MRI to measure my body cavity, determine what size liver would work. I met with a psychologist, a social worker. We went over my insurance. We discussed aftercare. We met with various members of the transplant team. There was one thing, though, that was really concerning to me, because the next step in getting listed was you needed to show that you had adequate support at home. I come from a very small family. My family is, until I get to cousins and extended family, my entire family is here right now. My brother, my husband. My brother doesn't have any children, has never been married. My mother was an only child. There just wasn't a lot of family. But your care team doesn't need to be family. And my mother was still living at the time, but we knew that was not going to be something that would work very well. And we decided to bring my brother on the care team. My brother doesn't do much better with medical stuff than my mother. I'm sorry, I'm kind of picking on you now, Andy. But my care team, and we had to have a second meeting at Henry Ford. The care team had to be there. Tom was, of course, my #1 person. But we have a very good friend. She's a hiker like I am, and it's Dr. Kathy Fulgenzi wearing the green parka. She was a semi-retired family physician at the time. She's fully retired now. And my brother. And we figured my brother could drive me anywhere, anytime, in any kind of weather. That's the kind of brother I have. And he's very good at fixing things, and he's good at taking care of stuff. And we thought if he made a major medical guffaw, or if he fainted at the table, because we didn't know what was going to happen during this meeting, we'd have Kathy there. In the end, it all worked out great. And a couple other people I met along the way. Actually, the surgeon was Dr. Michael Rosari. And I owe this man so much, and I think I've met him probably 3 times. You know, you think of the people that, you know, really help you in the process, and I still see Dr. Munka, and when I go back to Henry Ford, which I do now once a year, you know, I'm always hoping that I get to see him. But you're assigned, when you're listed, at least at Henry Ford, you're assigned a nurse coordinator. And Michelle McGee was our nurse coordinator. She was wonderful, very smart woman. She graduated with her bachelor's degree from an Ivy League college. I didn't do that. She became a nurse, and she was just, you know, I knew she was also dealing with many other patients who were, you know, in the same situation as me, but I knew if I contacted her, she would get back with me, and you know, she was just wonderful. And I've told her this, I mean, on a couple of occasions. I credit her with saving my kidneys, and well, and anyway, I digress. So this was about the time, maybe a year after the listing, that I did start to experience some of the physical symptoms, more physical symptoms than what I've been having. And I had something known as esophageal varices. And this is what they look like. You know, these are, we'll have Q&A afterwards, and the doctor can explain what they are a lot better to you than I can. But I only knew that the symptom I was having when these became part of my life. Bowel movements or foul bowel movements when you've had internal bleeding are just gross, nasty, nasty, nasty. I knew I was having internal bleeding. I got in touch with Michelle. Michelle suggested, because I think by the time I thought, oh, I think I better call a doctor, it was like a Friday afternoon. And yeah, it closes. And Michelle said, I think you should be a direct admit to Borges. I'll do it. You know, I'll make, you know, some contacts. And so I was admitted. I spent, I think, 2 days in Borges. Yeah, and Tom is telling me I've got to watch my time. So I spent a couple days in Borges. When you are listed for a liver transplant, one of the things that, you know, how do you decide? I mean, do you decide because somebody's a nicer person or somebody is, you know, they're more worthy? There's a system, and it's the Model End-Stage Liver Disease Calculator. It's called a MEL score, and that determines the priority in which patients get the transplant. And they take certain numbers, you know, for lab results, you know, whether you're on dialysis or not. My MELD score when I was first became listed was 13. It remained there for about a year. It actually dipped down to an 11 once, and then I thought, whoa, maybe. But then it soon moved up to 19 and 20, and livers and other donated organs, there's a system geographically for allocating those. And sometimes when you hear that a person has, you know, they seem to have gotten a liver or some other organ, you know, faster, or maybe there's a bit of controversy, you can, or at least at the time, you know, I got listed, you can list yourself at multiple centers. Now, obviously, you have to have the means, you know, if you're wealthy and, you know, you can fly somewhere, you can set up another residence somewhere. People do it, though. So these are the centers. So Christmas 2017, I'd had that bout of internal bleeding. 17 was the beginning of more health issues. I started developing, I gained about 20 pounds the month of January of 18. I mean, it was all water weight. My legs looked like Gumby. I could hardly squat. I literally thought my thighs were going to burst open. And I was still working full time, but I'd gotten into this routine. I'd, you know, go to work, come home, go to work, come home, and that was pretty much all I did. I worked on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. It was a Saturday. And if anybody here knows Mandarin, it's Happy St. Patrick's Day in Mandarin. We went out to Hunan Gardens that St. Patrick's Day. Tom and I have a tradition. We almost always, usually Saturdays, but sometimes we mix it up. We have a date night. I was not eating much by this time, but you know, we did our date night. I think I ordered some vegetarian, you know, steamed dumplings, and there was a mix-up. And while we were sitting there, my phone rings, and it's Michelle from Henry Ford, you know, and I pick it up, and I think, well, you know, is there some lab that I didn't do? Or, I mean, I'm oblivious. And Tom realizes who it is, and he just stops. Well, they have a liver. Now, the liver that they had, and if it was explained to me on the phone, I didn't understand it. When you get a transplant, there are different qualities of livers. There's even such a thing known as a living liver, a living donor. But the donor of this liver that was available, it was donation after circulatory death. And those apparently are only good about 50% of the time. But, we didn't know that, though. This was a call from Michelle. I was on the list. We said we're going to be coming there, and she said, I'll call you later and I'll give you details. But we did open up our fortune cookies before we left. And my fortune, I kid you not, you will be fortunate in the opportunities presented to you. And I just thought about this the other day, that it's opportunities. So remember that. So we left the restaurant. We didn't have a timeline, but Michelle called us, told us she wanted us there, I think around 1 o'clock, and going into Henry Ford at 1 o'clock in the morning, it was so quiet. I mean, that place is just a buzz of activity. And once we were admitted, I was brought into a room where I changed. We learned at about 4 a.m. that liver was not going to work. And the nurses, of course, were very, very, apologetic. And but that is not uncommon. And I thought, well, it's March. I still am teaching. I was teaching a class, overload in the history department. It'd be better if I had a liver transplant in the summer anyway. But I got a call. When we came back to Kalamazoo, I got a call that same afternoon, Sunday afternoon. There was another liver. And this one was a donation, after brain death. And Michelle was, she felt pretty confident that this one was going to work. And so on March 20th, 2018, I was one of 96 surgeries performed at Henry Ford, one of 8,250 performed in the U.S. I went into surgery. I think I was in there about 8 or 9 hours. Tom received a few updates. This is where I'm in the ICU. I didn't take a lot of pictures. I was really scrambling. My brother had some, but my recovery was good. And pretty soon they moved me. I was in ICU for about 3 days. I think I was in the hospital for about 7 days total. I look crazed out of my mind in that photo on the right. I actually did have a really bizarre dream about Torch, and I think I've shared it with you, Jim Coppinger, but we don't have enough time for it, but it was bizarre, and it was about Torch, and it involved Dick Fink, and that's all. No, and Dick Fink had an ex-wife, and I don't know if he does have an ex-wife, but in the dream he did. So anyway, they got me walking. And I have to say, it was probably Thursday was the day I really started thinking about everything that had happened, started wondering about, who had been the donor. I still don't know. I've written once. They moved me out of Henry Ford, and Wayne State has, it's like a little apartment building. And it's literally right next to the hospital. And we were in this 1-bedroom apartment. We stayed there for a couple more weeks. And I did really well. And then came home, and this is homecoming. Frank was very glad to see me, and I'd forgotten how I would walk around with a pillow in front of me. I'd walk around with it, or when we rode in a car, I would have it, just to kind of protect that incision. I retired from Western in 2020. Life is really good. Frank, sadly, he was part of my recovery in the first year of my retirement, but he lived 14 and a half years, and then we got Callie, and that's a very cute picture of Callie. I've become involved in the Ladies Library Association. I do a lot of hiking. I'm amazed at the amount of work I've been doing. I've been doing work up at the Meyer Heritage Center, and this is from an exhibit. They did an exhibit if you're a West Michigan native, Thrifty Boy, Thrifty Acres. But then I've been working on a project involving the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame collection. So in any case, you can have two kinds of incisions, the Mercedes-Benz incision or the J incision. And these were things I really didn't know too much about. I didn't get on a Facebook group for any transplant support until after, and I'm glad I did, because some of the things that people post, I would have seen maybe what a scar looked like, but, and I thought, if it's okay with all of you, if you want to see my transplant scar, I thought that might be the next thing, we could do. And that's the scar. And I am absolutely serious. I've never, you can see my scar, and especially if any of you doctors want to see my scar. I don't know, have you ever even seen my scar though, Andy? Probably Dr. Dewan and my husband are the only two people in the room who have seen it. But anyway, that's my little talk, that's my story, and if you have any questions, I'll try and answer, or if you want to direct questions, I hate to put you on the spot, Dr. Dewan, but there may be medical questions I'm simply not equipped to deal with. So.
Thank you so much, Sharon. We're really, really glad that you recovered so well because you're a treasure for Kalamazoo. But also I wanted to know, how does it affect you emotionally when you get a transplant and mentally?
I thought I was going to run away from here, but I was surprised. I actually went back to that conference, that PSC conference. They had it virtually online last year, and a very high percentage of people who have had a liver transplant do have counseling. I think my counseling was really getting that degree in holistic health. I knew that doctors had put me together and made me well, and I really wanted to be as well as I possibly could, and any complementary kind of medicine. But I do think about the person a lot. A lot of what I read and I worked off of, I've written about it a lot. I've taken some writing classes since this, and I don't know. I don't know who this. I have only written one letter. I need to write again. But I think about that person all the time. I mean, I don't know if it's a man, a woman. Certainly birthdays, anniversaries, children, friends. Yeah, it's a weird thought, knowing that you're walking around because somebody else, made that decision, and and I think, well.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, but I wonder if Dr. Dewan can help out. The question is, when you connect the bile duct, the common bile duct, to the remnant that patient has, the donor to the recipient, that segment left in the body, isn't that also subject to developing a sclerosis in the future? And I have another question after you answer that.
Yes, indeed. The parts of the bile ducts which have been left behind from the recipient, and they can develop changes of PSC in that as well. We don't do any screening. We just watch the liver enzymes and see how they do. Most of the immunosuppressants we give, anti-rejection drug, they seem to help entity as well. So most people do okay. But the patient, those who do poorly, who already have cholangiocarcinoma, those who have developed cancer, they don't do well. And,
I have another question.
Sure.
In an acute case of liver failure, beside Tylenol, which you mentioned, one of the key ones, is hepatitis E. Can you explain the hepatitis E? Because I was thinking, I've heard about C, about B, about A, about D, epsilon, but not E. Can you explain to me what the E is, please?
Fortunately, we don't have much problem of hepatitis C in our country or in the Western Hemisphere. We see much more in India and Pakistan and China. And usually hepatitis E is a mild disease. It behaves like hepatitis A, but it's oral enteral transmission, really. It's not a blood transmission. Most common age and type of people affected are the pregnant women. And they can get hepatitis E and they can get sick. But the mortality or the death rate is not as high as hepatitis B and C are. Fortunately, we don't see too much around here. I have the mic in my hand. I just want to congratulate her for all the good success that she has had. And I want to thank her for inviting me. And I just want to add one more sentence. The best results I have seen in her and in many other patients The most important thing is patient's attitude and patient's dedication to the disease. She was one of my most compliant patients. She did everything what she was supposed to do. And the second most important thing is a good supporting spouse. And Tom was the best man that I know, who was always with her. I've never seen her in my office alone. Tom was always with her whenever she came. I'm glad, yes, until COVID came. I'm glad she has done so well.
I shouldn't bring this up, but Sharon did make a fair number of resolutions to take care of her health, things to do. There is one resolution she made about 3 days after the transplant while she was lying in her hospital bed that, as I understand it, and I think she has not carried out yet, that was a resolution to kill me. And she's written about this, right?
Oh, I knew that sometimes people got very angry, and I was on prednisone, and prednisone is, I refer to that as a middle-aged woman's speed. And I started writing. A lot of what I've been writing is just, I mean, I think I had 30 single-space pages of what I had done up until this point with UC and PSC. And I started writing my angry transplant journal, and I looked at it the other day, and I was really mad at you. I was very angry with you, and I was convinced that you, and there was one nurse in particular, that you were trying to get me to eat something, and you were in cahoots, and yeah. So I realized what I was doing, and I started writing about it and keeping my mouth shut because I knew that was going to be a better way to go.